Hey everyone, Coach Mike here, and welcome back to another episode of the Language of Leadership podcast. I'm joined today by Deepa Purushothaman, the co-founder of nFormation, a company for women of color by women of color. She's also the author of The First, The Few, The Only, How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America. Deepa, it's so great to be with you today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
And before we dive into more about the book, your work at nFormation, and really what seems like to me is a incredibly meaningful, valuable, and necessary change that we're going through within corporate America, could you just share a little bit more about your definition of success? It seems as though reaching the top of the top at Deloitte, being one of the most senior people in all of the U.S. offices, isn't that just the pinnacle of success? Like, why take a step away?
Yeah, it's a hard question. It is what I thought I was aspiring to. So I should also say, when I joined Deloitte, I thought I'd be there for a year or two. So my background was actually politics and policy, and I really was interested in that. That's what I went to Kennedy School for. And I ended up at Deloitte, and I started doing well, and I moved really quickly. And so I became partner in my early 30s, and I also was our first Indian female partner we made in the U.S. So in a firm of 100,000 people. And so yes, I was known by my first name. It was pretty shocking when I decided to walk away. And I think for me, it was a combination of this greater purpose, this greater calling, not feeling well and wondering, like, why am I sacrificing my health and maybe even my happiness for this job that I'm really questioning? And so I started to really look at, what do I want to do with my life and what makes me happy and what do I think my work is? And what I started to realize is that my definition of success was in some ways still very tied to my parents and tied to what I think they valued. And I had to go through a year-long exercise. I spent almost 8 months in bed. I was actually really sick. And that process of really like unpacking, like, what do I believe for myself? What kind of leader do I want to be? What is my work in the world? Like really big questions about how I wanted to show up made me realize that although Deloitte was a great opportunity, I was learning a lot, it wasn't really where I wanted to have impact. So I had really had to redefine for myself that for me, success also means health, and also success isn't my parents' definition of success. Like I had to, it's very different for me, but it took me 40 years to figure that out. So.
Well, it's an act of courage and certainly an act of bravery to not only find your own definition of success, but also then act on it and actually take a step off of the well-trodden path that you were forging for yourself. Your focus now at nFormation is, as you write, a company for women of color by women of color. Can you help our audience and viewers understand a little bit more about what women of color are, and then we can unpack a few of the key concepts in your book?
Sure. So a lot of the, institutions, the workplaces, even schooling systems that are, established in the United States, a lot of the people in power, a lot of people who sit in the seats are white. And so, as a Indian woman growing up in the United States, I didn't see myself always represented. I didn't see the way I looked, the way I saw it. I know we'll talk about this a little bit more. I didn't see myself. And so there were really big questions about, as a result, who am I? What's my voice? What am I really looking for? And so I define women of color, and it's a self-identification, because I think it's really dangerous when we decide like who a woman of color is. And there are a lot of organizations and groups that are focused on Black women or focused on Asian women or focused on, Latino women, but there's actually very few organizations that are focused on the diaspora. So basically, it's a self-identification. It's anyone who doesn't identify as white, and it's a complicated term because even a lot of Latina women will say I pass as white. I'm white passing Latina women. So again, that's where that complication comes in. But it's really also an important idea because the research suggests that by 2060, women of color will be the growing majority in the workforce, entering the workforce. And so as a cohort, as a group, part of what I'm asking us is who are we? What is our voice? As we step into leadership, we can't continue to mimic what we've seen before us because that kind of leadership doesn't work for us. And so that's really a lot of what nFormation is about. But the term itself is complicated. Some people see it as a political identity. Some people see it as a ethnic identity. I think it's really self-identification, but it's about not necessarily coming up or seeing yourself as a white person in the United States. And that is fraught with a lot of complication and a lot of history. So.
And Deepa, you allude to there the concept of mimesis, that we as humans like to replicate what we see, whether it be behaviors or language people use. Would it be possible to share with us a little bit about first just your own experience and who you looked to as a leader or role model in your life. And then maybe share with us in the workplace, where does that lead us into some challenges?
Yeah. It's complicated because for me, you shared with me, you were going to ask me this question. I don't know that I have a great answer. I think growing up, I was always looking for role models because, again, I didn't see myself. So to be super clear, I didn't see myself in my teachers. I didn't see myself like out, in the community, working at a store. I didn't see myself on television. I didn't see myself in stories that were written about. Like I literally didn't see myself other than my parents. And we had a very small Indian community at the time that we were a part of. So I often didn't see myself ever. And so to see role models or to have role models, I think was really complicated. I, turned it to like Wonder Woman or to superheroes like that, or to women I saw on television and tried to find ways that I could emulate, I think, their strengths, but I think it was really complicated. And so for me, a lot of what I'm trying to do is really redefine leadership, is to really come into a new definition. So I think I looked to, Wonder Woman is the only one that's coming to mind because it was kind of following your own rules, right? And defining your own power and, paving your own way and figuring out your own identity in a system and a structure that didn't see her in some ways, right? That she, had to be one way during her day job and then she would really morph into this other thing. And so there's probably more to that story that I haven't even really unpacked, but I struggle with other role models because there wasn't a lot I could relate to. And that was part of my confusion around identity. And so what voice do I have? I think in the workplace, what we find is that a lot of us have been taught that leadership looks like the white men that come before us. And it's usually when I do an exercise, when I take stages and I say, what do you think of when I say leader? What do you think of when I say pilot? What do you think of when I say professor? I'm giving you the short, version, but and in a longer exercise, most people will think of a white man, usually in their 40s or 50s, with graying salt and pepper hair, and usually dressed in a blue power suit. And that is our definition of power and our definition of leadership. And so as women of color or people who don't necessarily look like that, when you come into spaces, that's a lot of what we reward. That's a lot of what we, emulate. That's a lot of how we grade people. And part of what I'm trying to unpack and part of the complication of workplaces is if we continue to mirror that, one, most of us are going to opt out or find it really difficult. So many of the women I interviewed 500 women in writing the book. They really were sick. They were really struggling with that tension around conforming. They would say things to me like, I sit in a seat of power and I don't feel powerful. And so I think we really need to recognize that. But I think the other part of that is, as women of color, we come from histories and cultures and like other ways of being that there isn't space for in the workplace. And so it's almost twofold. One, I don't want that to be the only norm because I think it denies some of the other magic we can have in the workplace. But two, I think it also denies a lot of who we are and as a different group. And we need more voice and more space for us to show up in leadership that may look different. And so for me, that might be drawing on my culture or drawing on my history or, bringing the things that my parents brought over to this country, but there hasn't always been space for talking about in the workplace.
And as you write about in the book, it's very well documented. The numbers are very clear. Mm-hmm. The number of women of color who come in at entry-level positions and the number of women of color who are in senior level, executive level roles, there's a huge disparity.
Yep.
Not only that, but sadly, the reality is that Asian women, Black women, Latino women are paid compared to white male counterparts in a declining order of dollars to cents. As a young woman of color beginning her career today, if I was a teenage woman of color and I'm going for an internship or my first job or an interview, what are some of the concepts that you think that I should really keep in the forefront of my mind?
Yeah, I almost want to unpack a little bit because I do have data for Asian women in particular, given your audience. Please, one of the things I would share is that and I posted this recently, but if you look at the data, we actually were making twice as many white women CEOs or executives compared to Asian women. So it's literally a 50% difference in Asian women, even though the credentials are the same. So it's significant. We also find that for Asian practitioners, there's two drop-offs. There's a drop-off when you move from individual kind of like I own my own work to being a manager in a team. We call it, leading a team. So individual contributor to leading a team. A lot of Asians will drop off, women in particular, at that level because the idea of managing others and telling people what to do is very hard culturally. And so that's like one spot. And then it's a spot right before the executive level where we sometimes think, we look at Asian people, not just women, but we think they don't necessarily have the leadership qualities. They're quiet. They're the model minority is what we say in the United States, right? They do what they're told. We do what we're told. We're good executors, but we're not always good leaders. We don't always voice what we think. And so those are two levels or two places where I think the Asian experience, especially in corporate spaces, is very different, and we need to talk about more. For young women coming in, or young men coming in, young people coming in, I would say just be more open. I think we come to the workplace with these ideas of how we have to be or what we're going to learn, or if I don't get this exact experience, then I'm not going to, learn anything from this. And what I tell people when I work with them when they first come in is just come in with your eyes wide open. Sometimes the things you're going to learn are not the things you came in thinking you were going to learn. So for example, if you came into Deloitte or came into accounting and you thought, I'm going to learn like some nuance of accounting or some nuance of strategy, it may be more that you learn how to interact with people or lead a team, or you learn something about presentation skills. And so I think sometimes we're very, very narrow in how we think, an experience or the start of our career should be. And sometimes, again, the magic comes in realizing you're learning a lot. And it's sometimes the things you don't want to learn, or that sometimes the things that are hardest are the things that you actually need to learn at that moment. So my advice is just kind of almost be a sponge and be open to what you're learning, and try things. Don't assume I'm bad at math, so I'm not going to try that. Try it. And you may surprise yourself.
One area of the book that I found incredibly insightful and particularly helpful for me as someone who doesn't identify as a woman of color is not only did you provide the high level thinking behind your work and your research, but then you also provided very tactical and practical approaches for how women of color can be leaders in the workplace. Would it be possible to walk us through maybe one or two of those specific tactical pieces of advice or guidance that you have? Because I think our audience would really benefit from it.
Yeah, one, and I think this is relevant in whatever context, whatever country you're in, but the one I tell in the book that I really like is around microaggressions. So these are when someone says something to you that is maybe, not meant to be hurtful, but is very hurtful. So it could be a small thing, or it could be just outright racist, where they're saying something about your race or gender or who you are in some fashion or form that's really offensive to you. So it's a spectrum. And I think we often don't teach people, like all people, whatever color you are, whatever age you are, we don't really teach people what to do when that happens. We just we just expect everyone's going to know how to handle it. And so what I tell women of color to do is to literally practice. So it doesn't have to be, race related. So for me, I made partner really young, and being Indian, I look young. I look younger than I am. And I always did when I was at Deloitte. And so for me, people often used to say, where's the partner? Like when I was in the room, like, where's the partner? They would always default to the man or the older person in the room, because it could never be me in their mind. And so I used to get very edgy about that and used to get very uncomfortable or think like I'm not doing something right. What I tell women of color to do, and what I started doing, was I would write out responses. So when someone said, oh, like, where's the senior partner? Or you can't possibly be in charge, or you look too young, I started to practice, what am I going to say? So every single time I wasn't so caught off guard. So I tell women of color or people, write out 3 things you can say in that moment, but then also practice saying them, because sometimes there's a disconnect between knowing what you want to say and actually practice saying it out loud. And sometimes we actually in those moments don't feel powerful, but if we know what we're going to say and if we practice, we can actually take our power back in those moments where we don't feel powerful. So my advice would be, whatever you are, like if there's something that keeps coming up for you, like maybe you are height challenged, maybe you are soft spoken, like maybe people think you're an introvert, like whatever that is, but you keep getting that feedback in different ways, that's probably going to be the same feedback you get for a good part of your life. So practice how you want to respond to that, and realize that some of that is less about you and having to change who you are, and more about just how people are interpreting that. And it's about setting boundaries and taking care of yourself. So the final part to that is, when I used to get really upset, at some point I'd stopped getting upset when people would say that to me, because I realized that was about them and their bias on what they thought a leader was. It had nothing to do with what I look like or, how I dressed or any of that stuff. And that wasn't my responsibility. I think that was the big change. I can't change that about them, but I can change what they think once I speak, once I stand in front of the room. And I'm going to focus on those things, not the things I can't worry about.
Fantastic. And as you share, Deepa, it seems as though the openness to discuss this topic and related topics, especially around maybe I can say the general theme of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace, thankfully is becoming a more common discussion. Mm-hmm. I know we're still just scratching the surface. Mm-hmm. So what do you think are the questions that aren't being asked that we need to ask ourselves more? Or what are the questions that the C-suite is not discussing enough that you feel like, from your perspective, really need to be on the table?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue that we have to overcome, and we're starting to see it in the US talked about a little bit more, is that a lot of the quote unquote white men in leadership seats, or the white men in these organizations, are starting to feel like inclusion doesn't really have to do with them, right? And so there's a group that I think see themselves as allies and want to lean in, but a lot of the way we've defined inclusion may make them feel excluded. And if we're going to really make progress on inclusion, I think we have to really have a different conversation. And what I try and tell people when I speak to companies is that we have a very narrow idea of power. We think of it as a pie, and that we're just kind of moving pie pieces around. And my definition of power is that it can get bigger. So this idea that we are taking opportunities away from people who may look like you and giving them to me sets us up in this competitive dynamic that is not helpful to you and it's not helpful to me, when maybe we should think about the fact that we actually haven't made the pie in the right way. We need to make it bigger. So by talking about inclusion and by talking about progressing women of color or advancing women of color, we're not taking anything away from white men. And I think that has to be a bigger part of the conversation, that they are part of the journey, and that this is really about redefining leadership and redefining work. Part of what I've uncovered as I've talked to all these people is that I don't think work is working for anybody, not just women of color, but for moms, for a lot of people, I would say, of my generation and younger, like even the white men I meet with, like they don't want to be, working, the 100-hour weeks and traveling like I did. They want a very different sort of lifestyle, to be home to raise children, or to, just be able to enjoy the things that they enjoy. So I think we're in a moment where we're really redefining what work means for all people. And I think inclusion has to move so that we're talking about it in that way. So it doesn't feel like it's very directed at just, taking power from some and giving to another.
Well, I think that's a perfect transition to us learning a little bit more about your work at nFormation.
Sure.
So you started nFormation, and you have a quest, a mission to redefine our conception of leadership within the workplace for women of color by women of color. Can you let us know what it is that you're up to at nFormation and where we can go to find out more about this?
Absolutely. We have, we have three things that we're doing in nFormation. So one is we create community. So I mentioned those employee resource groups. Sometimes companies don't do that well, or a lot of the women that come to us don't have that sort of safe space in their companies. So they come to us, and we've almost created, I would say, an ERG across industries, across sectors, across spaces. So it's a safe space where women come together and talk about different issues, not all related to inclusion, but just related to self-care, related to work, related to returning to work. So it's that sort of space. The second thing that we're doing is research. So we've put out some really visible research in the last year that talks about how women need to work together better. We did that with Billie Jean King, the famous tennis player, and that got a lot of attention. So we're going to continue to do research in the space around women of color and how work is showing up differently for different groups. And then the third thing is a big initiative we're launching in the fall is around placing more women of color on boards and really literally redefining what leadership is. So right now, there's a very narrow definition of what qualifies as board ready. You usually have to have been on a board before. You usually have to have like 5 things that you have. And unfortunately, most women of color don't have those things because we haven't been in those seats before. So we're starting a campaign to really redefine that and to actually showcase women who we believe are ready, but may not be the typical definition of what we think is board ready. So that will be our work for the next, year or so. And then I'm sure there'll be other things that come up. But that's really where it is. And you can find more about me and more about my work. Is the best place is probably my website. So Deepa Puru, DeepaPuru. We have information about the book, about speaking, and also the company there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today, Deepa. Really appreciate your time. And I know I certainly learned a lot. I know that our listeners and viewers will as well. And definitely encourage everybody to pick up a copy of The First, The Few, The Only. And we'll link to that as well.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for doing this work. It's so important to have conversations, especially. I wish I had had some of these conversations with my parents. I'm having them now, but I wish I had had them a long time ago. So,
well, thank you, Deepa. Keep in touch.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.